The bicycle shop smelled like chain grease and old rubber, and Marcus Doyle liked it that way. He was 71 years old, and every weekday morning he unlocked the same narrow storefront on Linden Avenue, flipped the sign to open, and spent the day truing wheels and patching inner tubes for the neighborhood kids who couldn't afford a new bike and the retirees who decided, a little late in life, that they wanted to feel the wind on their faces again. He drove a 15-year-old Ford pickup with a dent in the tailgate that he'd never bothered to fix. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, rinsed and hung to dry on the line behind his house because he didn't see the point in owning a dryer when the sun did the job for free. His hands were permanently stained at the knuckles with a faint gray from decades of handling chains and cable housing, and no amount of soap had ever fully gotten it out. To anyone who met him, Marcus Doyle was exactly what he appeared to be, a modest man who fixed bicycles for a living and had, at some point, retired from something unglamorous. Freight, maybe, or maintenance work. Nobody asked, and he never offered. His daughter, Iris, was the center of what remained of his world. Her mother, Vivian, had died of an aggressive cancer when Iris was 9, and Marcus had raised her alone in the small clapboard house he still lived in, 3 streets back from the shop. He had missed exactly one parent-teacher conference in 18 years, and only because he'd been in a hospital himself, recovering from the heart attack that had, though nobody but his attorney knew this, quietly ended his career at the helm of the company he'd built from a garage workbench into one of the largest renewable energy technology firms on the Eastern Seaboard. That company was called Solaris Grid Dynamics, and Marcus Doyle owned 68% of it. Nobody at Solaris knew that. The ownership sat inside an irrevocable trust, administered by an attorney named Renata Cole, who had been Marcus's lawyer for 26 years and understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what he had built and exactly why he'd chosen to disappear from its public face. Marcus had stepped down as CEO 11 years ago, following his hospitalization, handed the operational reins to a board he trusted, and gone home to raise the last few years of his daughter's adolescence without a company logo stitched to his identity. He had never planned to come back into the light. He liked the shop. He liked the quiet. Iris had married Preston Vance 3 years earlier, and Marcus had disliked him from the engagement dinner onward in a specific, controlled way he disliked very few things. Preston was sharp-jawed and handsome in the manner of men who had been told they were handsome since childhood and had structured a personality around it. He worked at Solaris Grid Dynamics, had, in fact, been hired there 4 years ago as a mid-level financial analyst, and had climbed with startling speed to chief financial officer, a rise that several board members privately found suspicious, and Marcus, watching from a distance through Renata's quarterly reports, found entirely explicable once you understood that Preston was extremely good at making numbers look the way he wanted them to look and extremely good at charming the people positioned to promote him. Preston believed his father-in-law was a retired mechanic living on a modest pension, and he treated Marcus with the specific weary tolerance of a man attending to an unfortunate but unavoidable relative. He never asked Marcus about his life before the bike shop. He simply assumed, the way people who have never had to work with their hands often assume, that there wasn't much to ask about. The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered by Iris over the phone with an apology already built into her voice. "Preston's parents are in town," she said. "Roland got some award, Civic Leadership Council, I don't know, some plaque thing, and there's a dinner at Cavallo's on Friday. Preston wants you there. I want you there." "Does Preston want me there?" Marcus asked mildly. "Or do you want me there?" Iris laughed, a little tired. "Both, I promise. Just with a good shirt, Dad. The one without the hole in the elbow." He went. He wore the good shirt. He drove the pickup and parked it 4 blocks away, out of habit more than embarrassment, and walked the rest of the way in the cold October evening, hands in his jacket pockets, past the valets in their red vests waving keys for cars that cost more than his house. Cavallo's was the kind of restaurant that communicated its prices through lighting alone, everything dim and gold and hushed, as if volume itself were vulgar. A hostess in black looked at his jacket for 1/2 second too long before leading him to a private room in the back, where Roland and Diane Vance were already seated at the head of a long table, and Preston sat beside them, and Iris was, apparently, still parking the car. Roland Vance had the look of a man who had spent 40 years being the loudest person in every room he entered and had never once been asked to stop. He wore a navy blazer with a crest on the breast pocket that Marcus was fairly sure had been purchased, not earned. Diane wore pearls the size of marbles and a smile that seemed to require conscious effort to maintain, as though smiling at people below a certain income bracket cost her something physically. Neither of them stood when Marcus entered. "Ah," Roland said, in the tone of a man noting the weather. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus said, and took the seat at the far end of the table, the one nobody else wanted. The conversation, once it resumed, orbited entirely around things Marcus had no stake in and no interest in pretending to have a stake in. A golf trip to Scotland, a renovation on the Van Cess Lake House that had run $400,000 over budget because contractors these days are simply incompetent. A mutual friend's daughter's wedding that had apparently required an entire runway to be closed at a private airfield. Diane asked Marcus, at one point, whether he still lived in that little house, with the word little doing the same work a scalpel does in surgery, precise and designed to cut exactly where it would hurt least visibly and most deeply. "Same house," Marcus said. "Raised Iris there. No reason to leave." "Of course," Diane said, in a voice that suggested she found the entire concept of staying in one house for 30 years to be faintly tragic, like an animal that had never learned it could migrate. Iris arrived halfway through the appetizers, apologizing for traffic, and the table's temperature rose 10 degrees the moment she sat beside her father. She reached over and squeezed his hand under the table, and he squeezed back, and for a moment the dinner was tolerable. Then Roland cleared his throat in the specific way men clear their throats before they intend to say something they have rehearsed. "Marcus," he said, "there's something Diane and I wanted to discuss with you. Man to man. All right. Preston's doing extraordinary things at Solaris." Roland said this the way other men might say my son cured a disease. CFO at 34. The board's practically eating out of his hand. There's talk, and I mean serious talk, of him being named CEO within the year, once Whitfield retires. Marcus kept his face perfectly still. He had, in fact, read the succession memo 3 weeks earlier, forwarded to him by Renata under a subject line that read simply, "You should see this." The board was indeed considering Preston. Marcus had also read, in the same memo, 2 lines from a dissenting board member that used the word irregularities without elaboration, and Marcus had asked Renata to quietly dig further. She hadn't reported back yet. "That's good for him," Marcus said. "It's good for the family," Roland corrected, leaning forward, "which is why we wanted to talk to you about optics." "Optics?" Diane picked up the thread smoothly, as though they'd practiced the handoff. "Marcus, we adore you. Truly. But you understand that when Preston is CEO of a publicly recognized company, there will be scrutiny. Press. Photographs at events. And a father-in-law who," she gestured vaguely at his flannel shirt, his weathered hands, "who works at a bicycle repair shop and drives a truck with a dented bumper, is not, forgive me, the kind of family optic that supports a young executive's brand." Marcus set down his water glass with exact, unhurried care. "What are you asking me to do?" Roland reached into his blazer and produced a plain white envelope, sliding it across the tablecloth with 2 fingers, The way a man moves a chess piece, he's confident will end the game. There's $50,000 in there, he said. A gift. Call it retirement supplement. There's a lovely retirement community outside Sarasota. Golf, pool, very manageable pace of life. We'd simply ask that once Preston takes the CEO position, you consider relocating. Quietly. No hard feelings, no drama. Just distance. For everyone's sake, including yours. It sounds like paradise, honestly. Iris's fork clattered against her plate. Dad doesn't need. What is wrong with you two? Iris, Preston said sharply, and it was the first time all evening he'd spoken directly, and the word landed like a slap. Iris stared at her husband, and something in her face closed like a door. Marcus looked at Preston. Do you agree with this? Preston's jaw worked for a moment before he answered, not meeting his father-in-law's eyes. I think optics matter, Marcus. I think you'd be more comfortable somewhere warm. That's all. Marcus let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. Then he picked up the envelope, unhurried, and slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket. Roland's expression flickered. A small, satisfied twitch at the corner of his mouth, the look of a man who has just watched a transaction close in his favor. Diane took a delicate sip of wine to hide her smile. Preston exhaled, visibly relieved. They thought he had folded. Marcus reached into his trouser pocket instead and produced a single crumpled dollar bill, smoothing it flat against the white tablecloth with 2 fingers, and set it in the center of his empty bread plate. For the water, he said, standing. He turned to Iris and kissed the top of her head. I'm tired, sweetheart. I'll call you tomorrow. He left the private room without raising his voice, without a single sharp word, and walked back out into the cold October night, past the valets, to where his truck sat quietly under a dead street lamp 4 blocks away. He did not drive home. The Solaris Grid Dynamics headquarters occupied the top 11 floors of a glass tower downtown, and Marcus still had a card. It had been 11 years since he'd used the private elevator on the north side of the building, the one that required a physical key rather than a badge, but the lock hadn't been changed because changing it would have required someone to ask why, and nobody at Solaris had ever thought to ask. He didn't go there that night. That night he drove instead to a low brick building on the edge of downtown where a light was still on in a second-floor office, because Renata Cole had never in 26 years gone home before 9. She looked up when he came in, wearing the same reading glasses she'd worn for a decade, pushed halfway down her nose, and didn't seem surprised to see him despite the hour. You look like a man who just had a very bad dinner, she said. They offered me $50,000 to move to Florida, Marcus said, dropping into the chair across from her desk. So Preston's optics improve when he becomes CEO. Renata's eyebrows rose slowly over the rim of her glasses. And you said? I took the envelope. He set on her desk, and then I left. She almost smiled. Of course you did. She leaned back, tapping a pen against a folder that had clearly been sitting, waiting for exactly this conversation. You asked me 3 weeks ago to look into the succession memo, into the word irregularities, and I was going to call you tomorrow. She opened the folder and turned it toward him. It's not irregularities, Marcus. It's a pattern. I brought in an independent forensic account last week. Off the books, nobody at Solaris knows. What we found isn't sloppy bookkeeping. It's architecture. Somebody built this deliberately. Marcus put on his own glasses, cheap drugstore readers, the kind that cost $12 and did the job fine, and studied the first page. Spreadsheets, wire transfer logs, a shell entity called Meridian Sustainable Partners LLC, registered in Delaware 18 months ago, whose sole listed officer was a name Marcus didn't recognize, but whose registered agent shared an address with a law firm that, Renata's notes indicated, had done personal estate work for the Vance family for over a decade. Walk me through it, Marcus said. Renata did, patiently, the way she'd walked him through 1,000 contracts over the decades. 18 months ago, as CFO, Preston had quietly restructured Solaris's international patent licensing arm, the division responsible for licensing the company's core solar storage technology to manufacturing partners overseas. On paper, the restructuring routed licensing negotiations through Meridian Sustainable Partners as an independent brokered consultancy, a layer of bureaucratic insulation that Preston had justified to the board as reducing legal liability exposure. In practice, Meridian was doing something else entirely. It was negotiating exclusive below-market licensing deals with a Southeast Asian manufacturing conglomerate called Tenlight Industries. Deals that undercut Solaris's own manufacturing partnerships by nearly 40%, and in exchange, funneling consulting fees back through Meridian into a private account that traced. After 3 encrypted hops that had taken Renata's forensic accountant most of a week to untangle directly to Preston Vance. The number on the final page made Marcus go very still. $9.2 million, Renata said quietly. Over 18 months. And it's accelerating. There's a deal on the table right now, final signature pending, that would hand Tenlight exclusive manufacturing rights to the next-generation storage cell for the next 12 years. The technology that took your R&D team 6 years and $400 million to develop. Once that contract signs, Marcus, it can't be undone. Solaris loses its single largest competitive advantage, permanently, and Preston walks away with what our accountant estimates will be a final kickback north of $14 million once the deal closes. When does it sign? 9 days. There's a board vote scheduled for Thursday next week to formally approve the licensing framework. Preston's built it, so the board thinks they're approving a routine partnership expansion. They have no idea what's actually in the fine print. And, she added, more quietly, there's something else. She turned to the last page. Iris's trust, the one Vivian set up for her before she died. Marcus's hands went cold on the paper. Preston's named as a co-trustee on a joint account he and Iris opened 2 years ago. Standard for a married couple. Nothing suspicious on its face. But 4 months ago, he initiated a transfer request to move $800,000 out of that account into a bridge loan for a property acquisition. Iris hasn't signed off on it yet. My guess, based on the timeline, is he's planning to use it to cover a shortfall once the Meridian accounts get audited, a place to hide the difference if anyone comes asking questions before the Tenlight deal fully clears. He needs her signature by the board vote. If she doesn't sign, the numbers don't balance in time, and someone might notice. Marcus sat with that for a long moment. Outside Renata's window, the city moved on, indifferent, taillights sliding red down the avenue. He's planning to disappear, Marcus said slowly, once this signs. That's my read too. 14 million and change is enough to vanish comfortably somewhere with no extradition treaty. Divorce filing pre-drafted somewhere. I'd bet money on it. Time for right after the deal clears. He empties what he can from Iris on the way out the door and leaves her holding nothing. Marcus took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He thought of the envelope in his jacket pocket. He thought of Iris's face going still and closed when Preston had said her name like a warning. He thought of the 11 years he'd spent tending a bicycle shop precisely so his daughter would never have to grow up in the corrosive glare of money, and how thoroughly, despite all of it, a predator had gotten in any way. "How fast can you move?" he asked. Renata Cole smiled the smile she reserved for exactly these moments. The smile of a woman who had spent half her career waiting for Marcus Doyle to say those words. "As fast as you need me to." "Then let's lift the trust," Marcus said. Quietly first, "I want my name back on the registry by Monday. And I want the forensic team doubled. Whatever it costs. I want an airtight case before that board vote, and I want the SEC and the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit briefed before Thursday, not after. And Iris. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Not yet, he said. Not until it's over. She doesn't need her father, the businessman, right now. She needs her father. I'll tell her everything the moment it's safe. Not a minute before. The next 9 days moved with the particular grinding intensity of a machine built specifically for this purpose, because in a sense, it was. Renata Cole had spent a career quietly managing the architecture of Marcus's anonymity, and now she dismantled it with the same care she'd once used to build it. By Wednesday, 3 independent forensic accountants, brought in from outside the city, vetted personally by Renata, sworn to confidentiality under penalty of contract clauses with actual teeth, had mapped the entire Meridian Sustainable Partners structure end to end. It was, as Renata had suspected, deliberate architecture rather than accident. Dummy invoices for market entry consulting, a rotating set of shell subsidiaries designed to make the money trail exhausting rather than impossible to follow, and the detail that made the youngest of the 3 accountants actually swear out loud when she found it. A second, smaller scheme running parallel to the main scheme, in which Preston had been quietly overbilling the company's own charitable foundation for community outreach events that a quick record check revealed had never taken place. Marcus spent those 9 days doing 2 things simultaneously, and to the outside world, they looked identical. He opened the bike shop every morning at 8, patched inner tubes, trued wheels for the Ferris boy down the street who was saving for his first 10-speed, and closed at 6 like always. Nobody who walked in during those 9 days would have guessed that the same hands truing a bicycle wheel had, the night before, signed a formal directive reinstating majority shareholder control over a $2.1 billion technology company, or that the quiet man in the flannel shirt had spent that morning on a conference call with the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division and, separately, with an agent from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit named Alma Reyes, who had listened to Renata's presentation of the evidence with the flat, focused attention of someone who recognized a case that would actually hold up in court. "This is clean," Agent Reyes had said at the end of the second call. "Cleaner than most of what we get handed. Your accountants did good work. They had good motivation," Renata said. On Thursday of the following week, the day the board vote was scheduled, Marcus called Iris. "I need you to come to the house tonight," he said. "Just you. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." She came at 7, still in her work clothes, looking tired in the particular way she'd looked tired for months now. A tiredness Marcus had assumed, wrongly, was simply the ordinary friction of marriage, and now understood had been something closer to a slow siege. He told her everything, not gently. There wasn't a gentle way to tell your daughter that her husband was a thief who had been planning to disappear with her mother's trust fund tucked under his arm, but completely, and with his hand over hers on the kitchen table the entire time, the way he'd held it at the dinner 9 days earlier. He told her about the company, about the 11 years of quiet retirement that had never really been retirement at all, just a controlling shareholder choosing silence. He told her why he'd hidden it. Not from her, never really from her, but from the world that came attached to it, the world that had, in the space of one dinner, tried to buy her father's absence for $50,000 in a condo in Sarasota. Iris sat very still through most of it. When he got to the part about the trust, about the $800,000 and the signature Preston had been waiting on, her face went through something complicated, grief and fury arriving almost simultaneously, and she put both hands flat on the table as though bracing against something physical. "He needed my signature," she said quietly. "That's why he's been so. He took me to dinner Tuesday. He's been nice, Dad, for the first time in months. I thought," she stopped, "I thought he was trying." "I know," Marcus said. "Don't sign anything," she said suddenly, looking up. "Tell me that's. I haven't signed it." I kept telling him I wanted to read it properly first, and he kept getting angrier every time I asked, and I thought I was the one being unreasonable. You did the right thing, Marcus said. You didn't sign a single thing wrong. Not once. She cried, then for a long time, and Marcus held her the way he had when she was small and the nightmares came, and neither of them said anything else about companies or trusts or the man she had married. And that, for that night, was enough. The board vote had been scheduled for the following morning at 9. Marcus arrived at 7, in a suit that had been sitting, pressed, and ready in a garment bag in the back of his closet, since the day 11 years ago when he'd stepped down. Renata met him in the private elevator, holding the same leather folder she'd brought to his kitchen table 9 days earlier, now 3 times as thick. Agent Reyes's team is positioned, she said, as the elevator rose. Service corridor, 2 floors of stairwells, and the underground garage. They'll wait for your signal. The moment you finish, they move. And the board. Whitfield doesn't know yet that you're coming. Nobody does, as far as they know. This is a routine vote on the Meridian licensing framework. She paused. You understand once you walk in there, Marcus, there's no version of this where you go back to being the quiet man who fixes bicycles. Not fully. People are going to know who you are. Marcus looked at his own reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator doors. An old man in a suit that still fit, more or less after 11 years, and thought about Iris crying at his kitchen table the night before, and about the $14 million sitting 9 days from his signature that would have made it permanent and untouchable. I know, he said. Let's go. The Solaris Grid Dynamics boardroom occupied the entire northeast corner of the 40th floor, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, looking out over a city just beginning to catch the morning light. 11 board members sat around a long table of pale ash wood, coffee cups and tablets arranged in front of them. And at the head of the table, wearing a gray suit that fit him the way expensive suits always fit men who had never once worried about the cost, sat Preston Vance. He was, at that moment, 3 minutes from what he believed would be the easiest vote of his career, a routine approval of a licensing framework that 11 of 11 board members had been carefully, gradually conditioned over 18 months to believe was a straightforward expansion of Solaris's overseas partnerships. He had rehearsed his opening remarks in the mirror that morning. He believed, with the specific and total confidence of a man who has gotten away with something for a long time, that this was simply Thursday. He did not expect the door to open at 9:02 and admit Marcus Doyle in a charcoal suit, flanked by Renata Cole carrying a leather folder the size of a small suitcase. The room went very quiet very fast. Whitfield, the outgoing COO, a heavy-set man in his 60s who had run Solaris's daily operations for a decade under an arrangement he'd always understood, vaguely, to answer to an anonymous trust he'd never once questioned, half rose from his seat with an expression somewhere between confusion and dawning alarm. Mr. Whitfield, Renata said, before anyone else could speak, her voice carrying the flat, practiced authority of a woman who had spent decades making rooms like this listen to her. I'm formally invoking the majority shareholders' right to address the board under Article 9 of the Solaris Corporate Charter. This meeting is now a mandatory shareholder disclosure session. I'd ask that no one leave the room. Oh, Preston started, half rising, his voice pitched somewhere between irritation and confusion. Is this? Whitfield was staring at Marcus with an expression of slow, cascading recognition, because Whitfield, unlike Preston, had been at Solaris 22 years, long enough to have shaken this man's hand at a groundbreaking ceremony back when the company was a single warehouse and 40 employees, long enough to remember a face under different circumstances. Marcus, Whitfield said quietly. Marcus Doyle. The name landed in the room like a dropped glass. Several board members actually turned in their chairs. The name Doyle appeared nowhere on any public document related to Solaris grid dynamics, but it appeared prominently on the original 1998 incorporation filing that two of the longer-tenured board members had, at some point in their careers, actually had reason to read. Preston's face went through a fast, visible sequence: confusion, recalculation, and then something colder as the pieces began, too late, to assemble themselves. He looked at his father-in-law, standing at the head of his own boardroom in a suit that fit him like a second skin, and Marcus watched the exact moment Preston understood that the retired mechanic he'd offered $50,000 to disappear to Florida was, in fact, the single largest shareholder of the company he'd spent 4 years quietly robbing. "This is absurd," Preston said, too loudly, standing fully now. "This man runs a bike shop. I own 68% of Solaris Grid Dynamics," Marcus said, and his voice was quiet, the way it had been quiet at Cavallo's 9 days earlier, the way it had always been quiet, because he had never needed volume to be heard. "I stepped back from daily operations 11 years ago for reasons that were mine and remain mine. I did not step back from ownership. And in the past 9 days, my legal team has completed a forensic audit of every transaction routed through Meridian Sustainable Partners, LLC, since its formation 18 months ago." He nodded once to Renata. She opened the folder and began distributing bound copies down the table. The same evidence that had made a hardened financial crimes accountant swear out loud a week earlier. "You're not here to vote on a licensing expansion," Marcus continued, looking directly at Preston now. "You are here because your chief financial officer has spent 18 months siphoning company assets through a shell consultancy, undercutting your own manufacturing partnerships to hand a 12-year exclusive license on core storage technology to a foreign competitor, in exchange for a personal kickback currently standing at $9.2 million and rising to an estimated $14 million the moment this deal signs. He has also, separately, been overbilling this company's charitable foundation for events that never took place, and 4 months ago he attempted, unsuccessfully, to drain $800,000 from his wife's trust to cover the gap once the audit numbers stopped matching." The room was absolutely silent. One board member had gone pale enough that another quietly slid a water glass toward her. Preston's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment, and then, with the desperate speed of a man watching his entire architecture collapse in real time, he found something. "This is a coup," he said. "This is a hostile old man trying to seize control of a company because he doesn't like his son-in-law. The wire logs don't care whether I like you," Marcus said. "Neither does the SEC." He nodded once, and Renata stepped to the small console at the side of the room and pressed a single button. The screen behind Whitfield's chair, which had been displaying the Solaris logo in soft blue light, went dark, and then filled with the first of 41 slides Renata's team had prepared: Meridian's registration documents, the wire transfers to the Shell subsidiary chain, the Tenlight contract clause by clause, the falsified foundation invoices, each one dated and sourced, and, crucially, already in the hands of federal investigators. Board members leaned forward. One of them, a soft-spoken engineer named Priya Anand, who had been the lone dissenting voice in the succession memo 3 weeks earlier, put her head in her hands and said, quietly, "I knew something was wrong with the Tenlight numbers." Preston made one last attempt, lunging toward the console as though he could physically stop the slides from existing, and Marcus simply stepped, without hurry, into his path. "Sit down, Preston. You don't understand what you're doing," Preston said, low and fast now, all the polish gone from his voice. "You'll destroy the stock price. You'll destroy Iris's. Do you understand what happens to her if I go to prison? If this company's stock craters?" "Iris already knows everything," Marcus said. "She knew before you walked in here this morning. She didn't sign the trust transfer, Preston. She never was going to. Something in Preston's face broke, then, in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the sudden, total understanding that every card he'd been holding had already been played by someone else while he was still rehearsing his opening remarks in a mirror. Marcus raised his hand, a small and unhurried gesture, and the boardroom's side door opened. Agent Alma Reyes entered first, flanked by two agents in plain dark suits rather than the tactical gear of a raid. This was, Renata had insisted, a white-collar case, not a television drama, and it would be conducted with the same clean precision as the audit that had built it. Preston Vance, Agent Reyes said, producing her credentials, "You're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and violation of federal securities law. You have the right to remain silent." Preston did not, in the end, resist. He sat down heavily in his chair, the same chair he'd rehearsed his opening remarks for that morning, and put his face in his hands while Agent Reyes read him the remainder of his rights. And the 11 board members of Solaris Grid Dynamics watched in a silence that had the specific texture of people recalibrating an entire worldview in real time. Whitfield turned to Marcus once the agents had led Preston out. "How long have you been watching?" "Long enough," Marcus said, and did not elaborate further, and Whitfield, who had known him a long time ago, did not ask again. The federal case moved faster than anyone anticipated, in large part because Renata Cole's evidence had been so thoroughly and cleanly assembled that Preston's attorneys, after a single afternoon reviewing the discovery materials, advised him in the strongest possible terms to accept a plea. He did. Wire fraud, embezzlement, securities violations. The judge, unmoved by a defense argument that painted Preston as a young executive who'd made an error in judgment under competitive pressure, handed down a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, with an order of restitution that stripped him of every asset traceable to the Meridian scheme, which was by the time forensic accountants finished their work. Nearly all of them. Roland and Diane Vance did not go to prison. There was no evidence, in the end, that either of them had known the specific mechanics of their son's fraud, only that they had enjoyed its fruits without asking uncomfortable questions, which was a moral failing but not, on its own, a federal crime. But the fallout reached them anyway, the way fallout always reaches the people standing closest to an explosion, even when they didn't set the charge. The story broke in the financial press within 48 hours. A genuine anonymous founder, hidden for over a decade, resurfacing to personally expose his own son-in-law's embezzlement scheme, was exactly the kind of story that print and cable news alike found irresistible. Roland's name, tied inextricably now to his son's, became a liability at the country club board he'd sat on for 15 years. He resigned before he could be quietly asked to. Diane discovered that the invitations to charity galas she'd spent a decade cultivating had a way of simply stopping, without explanation, the way water stops when someone upstream turns the valve. They did not end up destitute. They had assets of their own, separate from Preston's, enough to keep a smaller house and a smaller life. But the particular currency they had always valued most, the currency of being envied, of being deferred to, evaporated in the space of about 6 weeks. And Marcus found, when he thought about it at all, that he felt no particular satisfaction in that part of it. It wasn't the point. It had never really been about them. The point, on a cool morning some months later, was sitting on his own porch steps with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm in his hands, watching Iris come out the screen door in one of her mother's old cardigans, the one she'd taken to wearing since the divorce papers had finalized, and sit down beside him without a word. She had changed jobs, left the marketing firm where Preston's connections had originally gotten her the interview, and taken a position instead at a nonprofit that helped displaced factory workers retrain for jobs in renewable manufacturing. A job she'd found entirely on her own, with a salary that would have made Diane Vance wince, and that Iris talked about most evenings, with more genuine energy than Marcus had heard in her voice in 3 years. "Board wants you back full-time," she said after a while. "Whitfield called again yesterday. I told him no again yesterday. You do a lot of good there, actually running it." Marcus considered this, the way he considered most things, slowly and without hurry. "I do plenty of good the way I'm doing it. Renata, runs the legal side. Priya's taking over as CEO next quarter, and she's sharper than anyone Preston ever hired to protect him. The company doesn't need me behind a desk. It needed someone with enough stake in it to notice when it was being robbed. I noticed. That was the job." Iris leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had at 9 years old, the way she had at the kitchen table 9 days before the vote. "You could have told me years ago," she said quietly. "About the company. About all of it. I could have," Marcus agreed. "I told myself I was protecting you. Some of that was true, but some of it, if I'm honest, was just, I like being the man who fixes bicycles. I like that you love that man, and not some idea of what he was worth. I'd have loved you either way, Dad. I know that now," he said. "I think some part of me always knew it. I was slow to trust it, that's all." They sat for a while in the easy quiet that had settled back between them these past months, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Down the street, the Ferris boy rode past on the bike Marcus had built him from spare parts 2 years back, now outgrown but still running true, and lifted a hand in a wave, and Marcus lifted his coffee cup in answer. He thought, sometimes, about the $50,000 envelope Roland had slid across the tablecloth at Cavallo's, still sitting untouched in the bottom drawer of his desk, because he had never once considered it his to spend and had simply been waiting to decide what to do with it. He decided that morning, watching the boy pedal away down Linden Avenue on a bicycle nobody had paid a fortune for, exactly what he'd do with it. He'd give it to the shop, a scholarship fund, maybe free bikes and free repairs for any kid on the block who couldn't otherwise afford one. Let Roland Vance's money, for once in its miserable life, do something honest. It seemed to Marcus like the fairest kind of justice there was, not loud, not showy, no handcuffs glinting under a chandelier, just a quiet, permanent redirection of something built on contempt toward something built on care. That was the only kind of power he'd ever really wanted, the kind that didn't need anyone to notice it at all.